This video is brought to you by Imprint. While most of Europe struggles with stagnant growth and surging debt, one country is quietly bucking the trend: the Netherlands. Already one of the richest countries on the continent, the Netherlands has enjoyed some of the best post-pandemic GDP growth in the EU, strong real wage growth, and an ever-improving debt-to-GDP ratio, which fell to about 47% last year. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why the Dutch economy is doing so well, and what the rest of Europe might learn from it. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's just start by looking at the data. When compared to pre-pandemic levels, GDP has grown by slightly over 5%, a fair bit above the Eurozone average of about 3%, and way better than larger European economies like France and Germany, which have seen growth of about 2 and 0.5% respectively. While the most recent data has been a bit mixed, with a mild recession in 2023 and a slight dip in the first quarter of 2024, in August, Statistics Netherlands announced that the Dutch economy had grown by 1% in the second quarter of this year alone, roughly double the 0.6% analysts were originally expecting. This would equate to an annualized growth rate of over 4%, and while we should obviously be wary of inferring too much from a single quarter's worth of data, it's nonetheless a tentative sign that the worst of the recent economic turmoil might be coming to an end. On top of that, the Dutch state is in an impressively strong fiscal position. The Netherlands has always had a reputation as one of the more frugal European economies when it comes to government spending, but their position looks particularly secure at the moment. The Dutch government ran 4 consecutive budget surpluses in the years leading up to the pandemic, a remarkably rare feat in European politics these days. While they ran relatively large deficits when they were supporting the economy throughout the pandemic, spending has quickly fallen back to pre-pandemic levels. In 2022, the budget was basically balanced, and in 2023, the budget was only about 1% of GDP, and the effect of inflation meant that the Netherlands' debt-to-GDP ratio still fell to a new post-2008 low of about 47%. This is one of the lowest in Europe, below even famously frugal countries like Germany and Austria, and way below countries like France, which is currently struggling to get its deficit below 5% of GDP, and is looking at a debt-to-GDP ratio well above 100% of GDP. On top of that, the Dutch government ran another surplus at the beginning of the year, worth nearly 1% of GDP. So you get the idea. The Netherlands has enjoyed strong GDP growth without relying on government spending. What makes this all the more impressive is that the Netherlands was really very wealthy to begin with, and it's not like any of this growth can be seen as catching up. For context, according to Eurostat data from 2023, the Netherlands currently has a GDP per capita of about €58,000, well above the EU average of €38,000, and the 4th highest in the bloc, after only Luxembourg, Ireland, and Denmark. So, why is the Dutch economy doing so well? Well, there's obviously no simple answer here, but as we see it, there are at least 3 things that help explain the Netherlands' apparent overperformance. First, inflation came down faster in the Netherlands than it did in other European economies. For context, year-on-year inflation in the Netherlands fell below the ECB's 2% target in September 2023, when it came in at 0.2%. At the time, most other European economies were struggling with inflation rates above 4%. The EU average was 4.9%, and France and Germany were looking at 4.5% and 4.9% respectively. Now, this is in part because the Dutch government didn't do as much as some other European governments to protect households from the spike in energy prices, which meant that energy prices rose higher in the Netherlands back in 2022, but fell faster in 2023. Nonetheless, in retrospect, it looks like this was pretty good for the Dutch economy, because it meant that it was able to bounce back earlier and faster than in other European economies. And this takes us nicely on to our second reason the Dutch economy is doing so well: strong domestic demand. For context, one of the things that other European economies, including countries like Germany, have struggled with recently is the fact that domestic households just aren't spending money. This is both because consumer confidence is low, but also because inflation has eaten away at their real wages, which means that they just have less money in the bank. This has become a particularly acute problem now that the international economy is in a bit of a state, which means these countries can't instead rely on foreign demand when domestic demand is low. However, in the Netherlands, domestic demand has proved remarkably strong. This is in part because, as we mentioned, inflation fell quicker in the Netherlands, which meant that Dutch consumers started spending sooner than their European counterparts, but also because the Netherlands has enjoyed some relatively strong wage growth over the past few years. While real wages, i.e. wages relative to inflation, fell during the first inflationary spike in 2022, they've actually caught up over the past year or so, and by the end of 2023, real wages were basically back at the same level as before the pandemic. Wages have since grown by an additional 5.2% in the first 7 months of the year, a fair bit above inflation, with prices increasing by about 4.3% in the same time. This is in part because the labour market in the Netherlands has been remarkably tight for both unskilled and skilled labour, and now means that Dutch real wages are above their pre-pandemic levels. This has also been remarkably great news for part-time workers, who make up an unusually large share of the Dutch workforce. The one downside to this is that strong wage growth and strong domestic demand have continued to push up prices, and inflation is now running above 3%. Nonetheless, the risk of a so-called wage price spiral seems pretty low, and this is a small price to pay for solid real wage growth. The final thing helping the Dutch economy is relatively strong exports, which were the main driver of that recent spike in GDP growth we mentioned earlier. A good way of gauging this is by looking at the Netherlands current account, which is calculated as total exports minus total imports. The Netherlands runs a massive current account surplus worth about 10% of GDP, which basically means it exports a lot of stuff. Exports fell slightly in 2022 and 2023, thanks to reduced demand from European countries like Germany and Belgium, but have actually held up really quite well, largely because any decrease in goods exports has been offset by a steady increase in service exports, a lot of which was driven by the Netherlands' booming financial services industry. Fans of TLDR like you care about understanding the world around them. That's where today's sponsor Imprint comes into play. If you care about building a life of learning, then Imprint is the app for you. It's a new way to learn that turns your phone from an attention-sucking device to a tool for growth. You may have heard this before, but unless you've used the app, you likely haven't experienced something like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, bite-sized and interactive learning experience. It's the perfect antidote to a world where social media tries to keep us mindlessly dopamine scrolling day in and day out. Their library includes courses on topics like psychology, history, philosophy, finance, productivity, and many more, and quick reads you can consume in a single sitting. Since we last spoke to you about Imprint in September, I've done the philosophy course and am focusing on their course on the science of happiness. People study how to get in shape, how to eat right, and how to advance in their career. Understanding how humans are wired to be happy has been an interesting path to go down that I highly recommend to all of you. So make yourself feel better about your screen time, build a real habit of learning every day, and join the millions of people using Imprint. Plus, if you use the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen, the first 200 people will get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know that you came from us.